My grandfather died before I was born, about 10 years before I was born. I always regretted that. I thought he was thoughtless when he walked off the earth without meeting me. Mother remembered everything about Windham. She said Windham was her favorite place in the world.
Today, when you say Windham Center, most people, even in this small state, have never heard of it. But at the turn of the century, one of America's most important impressionists painted some of his best works here in Windham.
Alden Weir was inspired by Windham Center. It was so different, this quiet corner, from his studio in New York City.
It's in New York City at Weir's Washington Square studio that the story of Weir and Windham Center, Connecticut, really begins. In January of 1882, Weir was teaching an art class at his New York studio when Anna Baker, a young woman whose family owned a large farm in Windham, Connecticut, came to take an art class. When they met, it was love at first sight. And within 3 weeks, the two of them were engaged.
Weir was 30 years old in 1882 and very much in the mix in the New York art world. Weir was a leader, I think it's fair to say.
In May of 1882, Julian came to Windham to visit his fiancée Anna. And he came right to this house where Anna lived and this property. What's really interesting about Julian and Anna is that they both loved nature and they both responded to it in the same way. And in the first year of their engagement, they wrote to each other almost every day. Sometimes they wrote to each other twice a day. And in those letters, both of them talk about nature. They talk about walks they took in Windham. They talk about the scenery here and how much they loved it.
I waited some 15 minutes at the station before the train started, and then arranged myself to read the interesting novel you gave me. But often I caught myself nodding, and no sooner my eyes closed than the story was broken, and in place, I heard your voice. Then, when I would unfortunately awake, the reality that I was separated from you would make me pause, and looking on the landscape saw the space greater and greater between us by the fast speeding of the train. I would have given a great deal to have turned back to be with you. My trip to your place was so fully realized. It has been raining at intervals today in the city. Seems to me like a large prison, and I would forego all its attractions to be out in the quiet settings of Windham. There, rain could even be enjoyed.
Julian and Anna married on April 24th of 1883. Between 1883 and 1892, Anna and Julian's young family grew. Weir was busy teaching and painting in New York City. And the young family split their summers between Branchville in western Connecticut and Anna's family home in Windham.
Well, Windham is really an important chapter of his artistic life and personal life. And it's true, it's a kind of mystery why it's not as well known. Some of that is more recent history with the fact that Branchville, his other country home in Connecticut, is now a National Historic Site. It's run by the National Park Service, and so naturally it gets more attention. But Windham, it was a home place for Weir that he did some of his most important paintings.
In the winter of 1892, Anna gave birth to her third daughter, Cora, and 10 days later she died. And the love story of Julian and Anna came to a sad and tragic end. Weir was devastated by the death of Anna, and he accepted a commission to paint murals for the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. While he was in Chicago painting the murals, his sister-in-law, Ella Baker, took care of Weir and Anna's 3 daughters. Julian and Ella collaborated on raising the children, and eventually the two were married on October 29th of 1893. Ella and Julian spent several months a year every summer in Windham. Painting outside was central to Impressionism, and Weir loved painting the scenes at Windham. He painted his favorite oak, and he painted a Weebutuck Mountain, which was located south of the Baker property.
In part through his friendship with Twachtman and Theodore Robinson and other Impressionist artists, he began to really absorb Impressionism into his art, but with his own distinctive style. And I think this is a good example. This is a painting called Windham at Mullen Hill. It's circa 1895, which is really right in the middle of that decade when he was doing some of his most exciting landscape work. And it shows a kind of, which is typical of Weir's work, a kind of restrained Impressionism. You know, it's Windham from Mullen Hill, and yet as you look at the painting, does it look to you like you're looking down a hillside? To me, it almost looks as if you're looking up, but he titled it Windham from Mullen Hill. And this ambiguity, I think, is suggestive of a very important influence, and that's Japanese art, and particularly the 19th century prints of Hiroshige that Weir himself collected.
In 1895, Weir painted the Red Bridge, his most famous work. The bridge in this painting was literally the transition between the rural village of Windham Center and the industrial city of Willimantic.
The way he takes a structure that is essentially a new bridge and integrates it into this river setting, it so speaks of the influence of Japanese art. Bridges are so important in the Japanese prints that he was looking at. And he's incorporated and made it into a really iconic American picture that speaks to the blend of modernity and tradition.
The industrial hub of Willimantic was an important part of Weir's affinity with the region.
Willimantic at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century was at its absolute height as a community. It had become a small city by that time of around 10,000 people or so. It was incredibly prosperous for a community of that size. It was dominated by textile mills. Mostly cotton mills, large granite structures that were along the river that used water power. A few smaller silk mills that were powered by steam and set back several blocks from the river.
Despite the industrial character of the city, he chose to see the mills as part of a lush landscape, as we see in his Willimantic thread mills, painted in 1893. Photographs of the mills at the time show a more realistic scene that include railroad tracks. But Weir idealized the view. Instead of showing us a cluttered industrial scene, he shows us a gorgeous landscape with buildings embedded in it.
There were other paintings in the house that she had stories about. The factory village, which was painted in Willimantic, Connecticut, just north of Windham. Mother said that was the first time she was allowed to drive the gig. She and her father went over in the gig, and he got out and got his paints out and his stool and his brushes and everything. And he said to Mother, "Why don't you drive the gig back and bring some lunch to me?" So Mother said that's what she did. She got in the gig and she drove back. And I've said to her, "How old were you?" She said, "Oh, I was about 7, I think."
A clear sign that Weir was dedicated to painting in Windham was the fact that he had a studio built there in 1904. The studio was a very large building. It was 30 feet by 40 feet. It had a huge fireplace and a large window to let in northern light. It stood far back from the street in an open field that gave him wonderful views of the surrounding landscape. These two works, The Spring House and View from My Windham Studio, record some of those views. Weir remained friends with many famous artists during his lifetime, and several of them visited him in Windham. Albert Pinkham Ryder, John Singer Sargent, Childe Hassam, and Emil Carlson all visited him at his Windham home. The views of Windham were also compelling to his accomplished artist friends. Hassam painted the old oak Windham in 1905, a brightly colored impressionist painting of an old oak behind the barns. When Emil Carlson came to visit, he often stayed for several months at a time. In 1903, he painted Weir's place at Windham. Carlson said this was his best landscape. 8 years later, in 1911, he painted Windham Church, Connecticut. This painting depicts St. Paul's Episcopal Church, the church that was within walking distance of Weir's home, and that he attended from his first visit there in 1882 until he died in 1919. Sargent came in November of 1919 with his sister Emily and spent a long weekend with Weir. In this photograph, you see the two of them on the porch at Windham. And although his health was failing, he's laughing heartily as his friend Sargent makes a funny face on the porch. The two of them went down to Weir's studio. They talked about art, they looked at the paintings that Weir had in progress. After Sargent left, he sent Weir a very nice note thanking him for the weekend and saying how much he enjoyed it. Over the next few weeks, Weir's health continued to decline, and every day 2 farmhands would take him from his bedroom upstairs and carry him down through the house and outside and set him up where he could spend the day looking at the scenes that he loved. Towards the end of November, Weir, as was his lifelong pattern, traveled back to New York City for the winter. And it was there in the first week of December of 1919 that Weir passed away. Weir left behind not only a wife and 3 daughters, but a legacy of paintings that document his deep appreciation for the natural beauty of Windham, Connecticut.